The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, folded twice and sealed with plain wax, and it changed Joel McCrae's life before he had even finished reading the first line. He had been standing at the rough-hewn table in his kitchen when his neighbor Hank Prout delivered it, tossing it onto the wood like it was nothing more than a grocery list, when in truth it was the product of 2 months of correspondence arranged through a settlement agency out of Kansas City. Joel had written to the agency back in February, a decision he had arrived at slowly and with great difficulty, sitting alone in the house his father had built, and which now felt far too large for one man and a border collie named Duke. He was 29 years old. He ran a cattle operation of modest but growing size outside of Sagebrush Creek, New Mexico territory, and he had not courted a woman seriously since Clara Whitfield had married the bank manager's son 3 years prior. That particular heartbreak had not been catastrophic so much as quiet and persistent, the way a stone in a boot makes itself known mile after mile without ever quite breaking the skin. The agency had sent a profile, which was the polite word for a short paragraph written by the woman's guardian, describing the prospective bride in terms meant to inform rather than to sell. Joel had read plenty of these profiles in the past year. He had requested 5 of them, studied each one, and found reasons to set all 5 aside. One woman was too young at 16, and he had immediately written back to the agency expressing his refusal to correspond with anyone under 18. Another was a widow with 4 children under the age of 7, and while Joel held nothing against widows or children, he had been honest with himself that he was not yet ready for that particular brand of family formation. The others had simply not spoken to him in any measurable way, their descriptions reading like advertisements for furniture rather than introductions to human beings. This one was different. The letter was written in a hand that belonged to a man named Clement Doyle, who identified himself as the uncle of one Rose Doyle, age 23, of Abilene, Kansas. Clement Doyle wrote plainly, in the manner of a man who had spent too many years doing hard things to bother with decoration. He wrote that Rose was capable and hardworking, that she cooked well and kept a clean house, that she was educated to a reasonable degree and could read and write without difficulty. He wrote that she was good with horses and not frightened of hard weather. He wrote that she had been on her own, more or less, since the death of her parents 4 years ago. And then at the bottom of the paragraph, in what seemed like an afterthought but which Joel would later understand was the most important thing Clement Doyle had ever written, he added 2 sentences that made Joel set the letter down, look out the window at the long flat distance of the territory, and then pick the letter back up and read it again from the beginning. He had written, "She is stubborn and difficult. I tell you this not to dissuade you, but because she has made me promise to be honest, and I have learned it is easier to honor that promise than to argue with her about it." Joel read both sentences twice. He stood there in his kitchen with the morning light coming through the single glass window and Duke sitting on his boot, and he read those 2 sentences twice, and something in the region of his chest did a thing it had not done in 3 years, which was to move with interest rather than with caution. He set the letter down on the table, walked to the barn, and saddled his fastest horse. He did not saddle the fastest horse because he was leaving immediately. He saddled the fastest horse because he needed to ride, and when Joel McCrae needed to think, he rode. It was a habit formed in boyhood and refined through 29 years of a life that had required a great deal of thinking. He took the chestnut mare named Calico out past the northern pasture and into the open country where the land rolled gently under a sky so blue it looked painted, and he let Calico run for the better part of a mile before easing her back to a walk. Stubborn and difficult. He turned the words over as he rode. He thought about what it meant that a woman had made her uncle promise to be honest about her flaws in a letter designed to attract a husband. That was not the action of a woman who had resigned herself to whatever fate the agency might deliver. That was the action of a woman who had decided that if she was going to be sent somewhere and married to a stranger, the least she could do was ensure the stranger knew what he was getting into. There was something in that which Joel found not merely acceptable but genuinely admirable. He had spent enough of his life around people who smoothed their edges for the purpose of being agreeable, and he had found without exception that the smoothness was always temporary and the edges always returned, usually at the worst possible moment. He wrote back to the agency that afternoon. He wrote a letter of his own to Rose Doyle, which the agency would forward, and in it he was equally honest. He described the ranch, the size of the operation, the house, the land, the distance from town. He described himself as best he could without sounding either proud or pathetic, and at the end, because it seemed only fair, he wrote that he had read the part about stubborn and difficult, and that it had not discouraged him, and that he hoped she would write back. She wrote back in 12 days. The letter from Rose Doyle was nothing like what he had expected, and he had been careful not to expect anything specific. She wrote in a clear, direct hand, with sentences that moved efficiently from one point to the next, without wasting space on pleasantries she did not mean. She thanked him for his honesty about the ranch. She had questions, and she listed them numbered from 1 to 7, covering topics including the water source, the proximity of a doctor, the nature of the social arrangements in Sagebrush Creek, whether he owned his land free of debt, and what he expected of a wife in terms of daily labor. The 7th question was the one that stopped him mid-read and caused him to smile for the first time in what felt like a very long stretch of days. She had written, "Do you have strong opinions about how a kitchen ought to be organized? Because I have found this to be the source of more conflict between married people than almost anything else, and I would like to know your position before making any further decisions." He answered all 7 questions in full. He told her about the well and the creek that ran along the southern boundary. He told her about Doc Harding in town, and that it was 11 miles by horse. He told her about the social life of Sagebrush Creek, which was modest but not unfriendly. He told her the land was his free and clear, having paid off the last of the note his father had taken 3 years prior. He told her about the daily work of running cattle, which was considerable, and that he did not expect a wife to work the range, but that there was genuine labor in managing a household of the size he maintained. And about the kitchen, he wrote simply that he had opinions about almost nothing regarding kitchens because he had been eating his own terrible cooking for 3 years and considered any improvement to be entirely welcome, and that she was free to organize the kitchen in whatever manner made sense to her, and that he would stay out of it. The correspondence continued for 6 weeks. 7 letters total passed between them through the agency, and then at some point Joel had written his address directly onto a letter and Rose had begun writing to him without the intermediary. He noticed she had not asked permission to do this. He found he did not mind at all. By the 7th letter, he knew things about Rose Doyle that he had not expected to know before meeting her. He knew that her parents had died of fever 4 years ago, within a week of each other, and that she had been 19 when it happened, and had managed the small house and her uncle's affairs for 2 years before Clement sold the property and moved to a boarding house. He knew that she had opinions about cattle that were more informed than most men he had encountered, having grown up helping her father with a small herd on the Kansas plain. He knew she read when she could find books, preferring history to fiction because, as she put it in her neat, direct hand, fiction requires you to believe things that are not true, while history only requires you to accept things that already happened, which she found easier. He knew she had a dry sense of humor that appeared at unexpected moments in her letters, like a creek appearing in the middle of what looked like dry land. And he knew, from the way she wrote about leaving Abilene, that she was not running away from anything. She was moving towards something. She had decided on this course with clear eyes, and she was not frightened of it, even if she would not have claimed to be entirely without nerves. She arrived on the 22nd of June, 1878, on the afternoon stage from Albuquerque. Joel had been waiting at the stage stop since an hour before the scheduled arrival, which he recognized even at the time as a thing a composed man would not do. He had dressed carefully that morning, in his better shirt and the dark wool trousers he kept for occasions, and he had polished his boots with a thoroughness that Duke had watched with what appeared to be professional skepticism. He had ridden Calico into town and tied her at the post outside the stage stop, and then spent the better part of an hour standing in the shade of the overhang, exchanging minimal conversation with Bertie Walsh, who ran the stop and was constitutionally incapable of minding her own business. The stage came in hot, the horses blowing and the driver throwing down the brake with a sound like a gunshot. Joel straightened without meaning to. 2 passengers descended before she did, a traveling salesman with a sample case and a preacher's wife visiting from Santa Fe. And then Rose Doyle stepped down from the stage and looked at the town of Sagebrush Creek with the expression of a person making a careful assessment of new territory. And Joel's brain did the thing it did when he was looking at something that was going to matter for a very long time. She was not what he had pictured, though he had tried not to picture anything. She was medium height, with dark hair pinned up under a practical hat that had seen considerable travel, and brown eyes that moved around the town with a measuring quality he recognized, because he did things the same way when he arrived somewhere new. She wore a gray dress that was plain and well kept, and she carried a bag over one shoulder and held a larger travel case in her other hand, refusing without comment the offer of help from the salesman who had descended ahead of her. She looked about 23 years old, which she was, and she looked like a person who had thought carefully about being here and arrived at the decision herself, which she had. She found him before he could step forward. Her eyes came to his and stopped, and she said, "You are Joel McCrae." It was not a question. "I am," he said, "and you are Rose Doyle." "I am," she said with the briefest of pauses that might have been amusement. "You have a good horse, is that yours?" He followed her gaze to Calico, who had turned her head toward the new arrival with interest. "That is Calico, she is mine." "Good lines," Rose said. "She looks fast. She is the fastest horse I own." Something shifted very slightly in Rose's expression, gone before he could identify it fully. She looked back at him and said, "Well, I expect you have a wagon if there is luggage, and there is a trunk on the roof of the stage that is mine." He retrieved the trunk. He loaded it into the wagon he had brought for that purpose, tying Calico behind. Bertie Walsh watched all of this from the overhang with an expression of undisguised satisfaction at having something to report to the various parties who would later inquire. Joel was aware of being watched and did not particularly care. Rose appeared equally indifferent to the scrutiny, climbing up onto the wagon seat with the ease of someone who had done it many times before and did not require assistance unless she asked for it. They drove the 11 miles to the ranch in the long afternoon light, and they talked. This was the part Joel had been most uncertain about, the conversion from letter writing to actual conversation, but it turned out to be less difficult than he had feared. They spoke about the land, which Rose watched with evident attention, asking questions about the geography, the rainfall, the nature of the grass. She asked about the cattle, and he told her the numbers and the operation, and she asked a follow-up question that indicated she had understood the first answer completely. She asked about Sagebrush Creek and the people in it. She asked about his neighbors. He told her about Hank Prout to the east, who was a decent man and a fair neighbor, and who had 3 large sons who helped with the cattle work. He told her about the Garza family to the south, Francisco and Alina and their 4 children, who had been ranching that land longer than any other family in the area, and who were, in Joel's estimate, the best people within 20 miles. He told her about the town, the general store run by Horace and Mabel Finch, the saloon which he attended in moderation, the church whose minister was a reasonable man named Reverend Alcott. Rose listened to all of this with the focused attention she had applied to the land. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Your letters were honest. I appreciate that. Some of the men who wrote through the agency were not. How many did you correspond with? He asked, and then immediately felt that it was none of his business. She glanced at him. 2 others before you. One of them failed to mention that he was already married. The second had a temper that came through the letters if you knew how to read for it. And mine. She considered this seriously, looking out at the road ahead. Your letters were even. Whatever you felt came through, but it was not erratic. I find that more reassuring than charm. He thought about that for a good portion of the remaining drive. The ranch came into view as the sun began its drop toward the western rim, painting the low hills amber and copper, and Joel watched Rose see it for the first time. The house was not large by any standard, but it was solidly built. 2 rooms plus a kitchen addition his father had added in 1865, with a covered porch that faced south toward the creek. The barn was in good order. The pastures were fenced with wire and good posts. The cattle visible in the far field were fat and healthy. He did not say any of this. He let her look. She said after a moment, "It is a good property." "I have worked to make it so," he said. "I can see that," she said, and the plain directness of it was more satisfying than elaborate praise would have been. They were married 4 days later, on a Sunday morning, by Reverend Alcott at the church in Sagebrush Creek. It was a simple ceremony with Hank Prout and his wife Della as witnesses, and the Garza family in attendance, because Alina Garza had come with a quantity of food. She had spent 2 days preparing, and the clear intention of ensuring this event was marked with some degree of proper celebration. Rose wore the better of her 2 dresses, a deep green wool that she had kept folded carefully at the bottom of her trunk, and she stood at the front of the small church with an expression that was serious and clear, and without the falseness of performed emotion. Joel stood beside her and made his promises and meant them, which he had decided was the only justification for making them. After the ceremony, there was a modest gathering at the Garza ranch, because Alina had arranged it, and no one had the courage or the inclination to argue with Alina Garza about arrangements. Rose sat at a table with Alina and Della Prout, and within 40 minutes the 3 women were in what appeared to be a genuine conversation, Alina speaking in the mixture of English and Spanish she used when comfortable, Rose listening with full attention and responding in a manner that indicated she was not diminished by the unfamiliar setting. Joel watched this from where he stood with Francisco Garza and Hank Prout, and Francisco caught him looking and said, in the dry way Francisco said everything, "She is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Joel asked. Francisco considered. "Something softer, to match the arrangement." He paused. "This is better." Hank said nothing, which was Hank's way of agreeing. The early weeks of the marriage were not without difficulty, which was perhaps predictable given that 2 people who had met in person for the first time 4 days before their wedding were now sharing a house and the entirety of daily life. The difficulties were not large ones, but they were real. Rose had her own way of doing things, formed by 4 years of independence and the practical education of managing a household alone, and Joel had his own way of doing things, formed by 3 years of bachelor habits and the preceding years of his mother's household before she passed. These 2 ways of doing things were not always the same way. She reorganized the kitchen on the 2nd day, which he had promised she could do and which he maintained no objection to. But there was a moment in the first week when he reached for a tool in the barn where it had always been and found it had been moved to a more logical location by a person who had assessed the barn layout and determined his arrangements to be inefficient, and the irritation he felt was the kind that had nothing to do with the tool and everything to do with the adjustment of having a life that was no longer entirely arranged by his own hand. He did not say anything about the tool. She noticed. One evening in the 2nd week after supper, she set down the dish she was drying and said, without preamble, "You can tell me when something bothers you. I am not easily offended and I would rather know." He looked at her across the kitchen in the lamplight that made the room feel smaller and closer than it was in daytime. "The tool in the barn," he said. "The bolt cutters," she said immediately. "They were on the floor where anyone could step on them in the dark. I moved them to the hook by the door." "I know." "I found them. Did the location make sense?" He thought about it honestly. "Yes." "Then what is the actual difficulty?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "It is not the tools," he said finally, "or the kitchen. It is getting used to the fact that the decisions are not only mine anymore." Rose was quiet in return, and then she said, "I know that feeling. I have been making every decision alone for 4 years. It is strange to have someone who is standing to weigh in on things." He looked at her. "Is it a bad strange?" She picked up the dish again and finished drying it, setting it carefully on the shelf. "No," she said, "it is just strange." It was not a romantic declaration. It was something better than that. It was honest, and it moved them both forward in a way that declarations might not have, because it acknowledged the real territory they were navigating without pretending the territory was easy or that they were further along than they actually were. The real difficulty of those early weeks was not between them so much as it was external, and its name was Harlan Cobb. Harlan Cobb was a man who owned land to the west of Joel's property, a larger spread that he had assembled through a combination of legal purchase and methods that the surrounding ranchers considered questionable at best. Cobb was 42, broad across the shoulders, and possessed of the particular confidence of a man who had spent many years getting what he wanted through a combination of size, money, and the studied application of pressure. He was not violent in the obvious way. He was patient and systematic, which was in some ways worse. He had been pressuring Joel to sell the southern pasture for 2 years. The southern pasture bordered the creek, and access to reliable water was the thing Cobb most wanted and did not have on his own land. Joel had declined, twice formally and several times informally, and the matter had been at a stalemate since the previous autumn. Joel had mentioned Cobb in his letters to Rose briefly, describing the situation in the straightforward terms of a property dispute. He had not emphasized it because it was not, at that point, an immediate crisis. It was a persistent background pressure, the kind that a person learns to carry. Cobb came to the ranch 12 days after Rose's arrival, which was 8 days after the wedding. He came on a fine horse with 2 men behind him, and the manner of someone who had decided to reopen a closed conversation. Joel saw him coming from the north fence, where he was working with Hank's oldest son, Tom Prout, and he felt the familiar steadying of himself that difficult situations produced. He walked to the yard and waited. Cobb dismounted and made a show of looking around the property, his gaze moving across the new garden area Rose had started near the south side of the house, and up to the porch where Rose had appeared, having heard the horses, and was standing with the expression Joel was coming to recognize as her assessment face, taking the measure of things. Cobb looked at her with an appraising quality that Joel felt in his jaw. "So the reports are true," Cobb said to Joel without looking away from Rose. "You brought yourself a bride. Settling in nicely, are you, Mrs. McCrae?" "Well enough," Rose said from the porch in a tone that gave away nothing. Cobb smiled with his teeth and looked back at Joel. "I have come about the pasture. My offer stands and I have added to it. I will pay you $120 for the southern 40 acres. That is a fair price, McCrae, and you know it." "I have told you the southern pasture is not for sale," Joel said. "I heard what you told me. I am telling you the offer has improved and I am asking you to reconsider." Cobb's voice was pleasant in the practiced way of a man who understood that the threat lands harder when delivered pleasantly. "My answer has not improved," Joel said. "The land is not for sale." Cobb looked at him for a long moment, then up at Rose again, and then back at Joel. "A man with a new wife might think more carefully about his circumstances," he said, "about what it means to make enemies when you have something worth protecting." The silence that followed was very quiet. "I would be careful," Joel said, and his voice was entirely calm, "about how you finish that sentence." Cobb smiled again and touched the brim of his hat. "Just neighborly advice," he said. You think on the offer. I'll be in touch." He remounted and rode back the way he had come, his two men following without having said a word throughout the entire exchange. Joel stood in the yard until the three riders were far enough down the track to raise dust and no longer raise concern, and then he turned and looked up at Rose on the porch. She was watching the retreating riders with the same careful measuring look. "That is Harlan Cobb," she said. It was not a question. "That is Harlan Cobb," he confirmed. "He is the kind of man who considers pleasantness and threat to be the same tool," she said. "Yes," Joel said. "He will not stop." "No," Joel said. She looked at him then, and something in her expression had settled in a way he could not precisely define, like a person who has received a piece of information they needed and has incorporated it into their understanding. "Then we should think about what we do when he escalates," she said. "Because he will escalate. Men like that always do." Joel climbed the porch steps and stood beside her, looking out in the direction Cobb had gone. "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about it for 2 years." "Tell me what you have thought," she said. He did. And this was the moment, though neither of them would have called it that at the time, when the arrangement between them began to become something more than an arrangement. They sat on the porch until the light was gone and the stars came up over the territory, and they talked about the land and the creek and the water rights and Harlan Cobb and the nature of the situation, with a kind of shared practical intelligence that Joel had not experienced with another person since his father's time. Rose asked questions that cut to the relevant point, and she offered observations that came from a different angle than his own, and twice she said something that made him see the problem differently than he had seen it before. She was, he thought, watching the side of her face as she looked at the night sky, exactly as advertised. Stubborn and difficult. He was beginning to understand that stubborn meant she held her position when she had thought it through, and difficult meant she did not simplify things to make them easier for other people to accept, and that both of these qualities were, in a person of genuine intelligence and good character, not flaws at all. The Cobb situation developed through the summer in the way Rose had predicted it would. There were small pressures first. A fence post along the eastern boundary mysteriously came down, and 3 of Joel's cattle wandered through before anyone noticed. This could have been accident. The second time it happened, in a different section of the fence, the probability of accident declined considerably. Joel repaired the fences and said nothing publicly, because he had learned that making accusations before he had proof was a way of handing Cobb a grievance to work with. Rose was the one who noticed the pattern in the timing. She had been keeping a quiet record of things, in a small notebook she kept in the kitchen, and one evening she brought it to Joel and showed him. The fence incidents, the one-time cattle had been driven near the creek in a way that seemed designed to establish a right-of-way claim, the visit from a man who identified himself as a surveyor and asked to cross the southern pasture, which Rose had declined with a politeness that was the same substance as Joel's rejection of Cobb's offer. The pattern was clear once you laid it out. "He is building a legal case," Rose said, "or trying to. He wants to establish that his cattle have traditional access to that creek water. If he can show enough incidents of access combined with his survey, he can take it to the territorial court." "You know territorial land law," Joel said, and realized as soon as he said it that he should not have been surprised. "My father had a land dispute with a neighbor when I was 15, she said simply. "It went to court. I paid attention." He sat back in his chair and looked at her. She was 23 years old and had been married to him for 2 months, and she had, in a small notebook with careful notations, identified the legal strategy of a man 20 years her senior, who had been conducting that strategy for the better part of a year. He did not say all of this, because he had learned by now that Rose found being told impressive what she simply considered practical to be more irritating than complimentary. Instead he said, "What do we do about it?" "We document our own use," she said. "Every time we water our cattle at the creek, every time we maintain the creek bank, every time we do anything that establishes continuous and active use of our own property, we record it. We do it consistently, and we do it with witnesses when we can. And we go and talk to the Garza family. Why the Garzas? Because Francisco Garza has been on that land longer than anyone, and he will know what Cobb has been doing to other neighbors. We are likely not his first attempt. She was right. They rode to the Garza ranch the following Sunday after church, and over Alina's coffee and the best tortillas Joel had ever eaten, Francisco told them that Cobb had tried similar strategies on 2 other small ranchers in the valley over the past 5 years. One had sold. The other had held out, and eventually Cobb had shifted his attention elsewhere. The key, Francisco said, was not to give him anything to work with and to make the cost of the campaign higher than the value of what he was after. Alina, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway in the way, Alina listened to things that were her business even when conducted in the other room, said, "What Harlan Cobb does not expect is a woman who keeps records. He thinks women make houses and men make decisions. Your wife keeping a legal notebook is not something he will have planned for." Rose looked at Alina with an expression Joel had not seen before. It was recognition, the look of one person identifying another who understands something important. "Then we should make sure he does not know about the notebook," Rose said. "Agreed," Alina said, and went back to her kitchen. The friendship that developed between Rose and Alina Garza over the following months was one of the things Joel would later identify as among the best consequences of the whole arrangement. They were different women in manner, Alina warm and expansive where Rose was measured and contained, but they shared a practical intelligence and a complete unwillingness to be underestimated, and they recognized these qualities in each other within the first conversation. Alina had 4 children and a 5th on the way, and a husband she adored, and a ranch she ran with the same competence and investment as Francisco did. Rose was new to marriage and to this land, but not new to hard work or to the application of careful thought to difficult circumstances. They met on Sunday afternoons more often than not, and they talked about things that mattered, and this friendship gave Rose a rootedness in Sagebrush Creek that she could not have achieved through Joel's connections alone. Through July and August, the territory was hot with the particular intensity of high desert summer, and the ranch work was substantial. Joel rose before sunrise and worked until the light failed, and Rose rose when he did and matched his pace in a different register, managing the household and the garden and the chickens she had acquired by trading 2 jars of preserved fruit with Mabel Finch, and often joining him at fence work or cattle moving when the labor required more than 2 hands. She was, as she had described herself, capable with horses. She rode well and without fear, and she had an eye for cattle that surprised the Prout boys when they worked together, which happened twice that summer. He noticed her the way he had not expected to notice his wife, which is to say with an attention that was not merely practical. He noticed the way she moved through work, economical and without wasted motion. He noticed the way she looked at the land, with a proprietary care that had arrived before he had even invited it, as though she had decided this was hers, and had begun the work of deserving it. He noticed the way she laughed, which was rare and therefore arresting when it happened, a genuine sound that she did not perform or modulate, coming out of her when something was actually funny rather than merely socially required to be so. He did not say any of this to her because he was not sure what to say, or whether it was something that should be said, or whether she would find it more awkward than welcome. He was, despite his practical competence and his genuine ease with most human situations, not a man who found the articulation of interior feeling to be straightforward. He had grown up in a household where affection was expressed through action and service rather than declaration, and he had absorbed this as his natural register. Rose, for her part, was engaged in her own private accounting. She had come to New Mexico territory with clear eyes and a realistic understanding of what she was doing. She was not a girl who believed in the romantic stories of her mother's era, about love arriving like lightning and changing everything in an instant. She was a woman who had managed her own affairs for 4 years and knew that the real texture of a life was made of daily choices and practical competence and the slow accumulation of trust. She had chosen Joel McCrae through a careful reading of his letters, and she had arrived prepared to honor that choice through the discipline of consistent action. What she had not prepared for was the specific quality of the man himself. She had expected competence because the ranch showed it. She had expected honesty because his letters had demonstrated it. She had not expected the particular quality of his attention, which was never intrusive but also never absent. The way he listened when she spoke as though the content genuinely mattered to him. The way he adjusted his position to give her more room in a situation without making a demonstration of doing so. The way he had never once looked at her with the expression some men used when they felt a woman had exceeded the lane they had assigned her. She had not expected the thing that happened when he smiled, which was infrequent and therefore significant, a shift in his whole expression that reached his eyes and made the world feel momentarily lighter. She admitted to herself in the quiet of an August night while he slept, in the early stages of something she had not planned for. She was not certain what to do with this information except to carry it carefully and see what it became. What it became was shaped by an evening in early September that Joel would remember for the rest of his life. The day had been long and difficult, involving a section of fence that had come down in the night and 20 cattle scattered across the neighboring territory and 6 hours of work to recover them and repair the damage. It was unquestionably Cobb's doing, this time witnessed by Tom Prout, who had seen 2 riders on the boundary at dawn. They had the witness. They had the documentation. They were closer to a legal remedy than they had been, but the day had still cost Joel a full day of labor and a portion of temper he had spent the entire ride home restraining. He came in at sunset and found the house lit warmly against the cooling evening and supper on the table and Rose at the stove, and something in the combination of these things, the ordinary domestic fact of a home that was tended, broke through the restraint he had been maintaining all day. He sat down at the table and did not eat immediately, and she brought the coffee and set it in front of him and sat down across from him and waited. She had learned by now that he sometimes needed a moment before words were available to him. Tom saw them, Joel said, 2 riders at dawn on the eastern boundary where the fence went down. I know, she said. Tom came by this afternoon while you were still out. He wrote it down. I have it in the notebook. He looked at her across the table. I am tired of it, he said, and the words came out with more rawness than he had intended. I am tired of a man who has everything deciding he needs what I have. I am tired of repairing what he destroys and documenting what he takes, and being patient about a thing that makes me want to be very much not patient. Rose was quiet for a moment and then she said, I know. How long does a man do this, he said. How long before the patient, legal, correct response runs out? A little longer, she said. Joel, we are close. Tom's testimony plus our documentation puts us in a position to take this to Judge Harmon and make it stick. Francisco says Harmon is a fair man and that he does not like Cobb, who tried to bribe him 3 years ago. We need one more documented incident with a witness and we can go to the court. And if the next incident is not a fence, he said, and heard the edge in his own voice. She met his eyes without flinching. Then we deal with what it is. But I do not believe Cobb will move to direct harm. He is a legal man, not a violent one. He uses the law as his weapon because he believes he understands it better than his neighbors. We are showing him he is wrong about that. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight was on her face and her eyes were steady, and she was speaking with the measured calm of a person who had thought through the situation thoroughly and arrived at a position she could defend. Where did you come from? He said. She blinked and the question clearly surprised her. Abilene, she said, you know that. That is not what I mean, he said, and he stopped because he was not entirely certain how to say what he meant, but he tried. I have been alone on this land for 3 years, and before that my father was here, and he was a good man, but he was not someone who thought in the way that you think. And I have neighbors I trust and friends I value, but there has not been in my life a person who I could sit down with in difficulty and trust to have already thought about it from the angle I had not considered. He paused. And you do that. Consistently. I did not know to expect it, and I find I am very grateful for it. The quiet that followed was of a different quality than the practical silences that had characterized their early weeks. Rose looked at her coffee cup and then back at him, and he could see in her face a careful calibration, as though she was deciding how much of something to allow through. "The letter," she said. "Your letter, the first one you wrote back to my uncle. You wrote that stubborn and difficult had not discouraged you. I read that 3 times. She paused. Most of the world considers those to be faults. You read them as information. That is not common. They are accurate descriptions, he said. I have not found them to be faults. No, she said softly, and the word carried something in it that she might not have intended to release entirely. He reached across the table. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a simple crossing of the distance between them, his hand coming to rest over hers where it lay beside the coffee cup. She looked at his hand and then at him, and she did not move away, and after a moment she turned her hand and held his. They sat like that for a while, in the warm lamplight with the night sounds of the territory coming softly through the window, and the supper cooled and neither of them cared. This was the opening, the first deliberate acknowledgement of the thing that had been building since June, and having crossed that small distance they began, tentatively and then with increasing ease, to close the rest of it. He told her things he had not told another person about his father's illness, and the 2 years at the end when he had run the ranch alone while also caring for the old man. The exhaustion of it, and the grief beneath the exhaustion, and the loneliness of a kind that does not announce itself loudly, but simply accumulates like dust in a closed room. She listened with the full attention she gave everything that mattered, and when he finished she said, "You have been carrying that for a long time by yourself." "There was no one to carry it with," he said simply. "There is now," she said, and said it without theater, the way she said the true things, plainly and with the weight of a commitment meant. She told him things about the 4 years after her parents, the peculiar loneliness of being competent enough that people assumed you were fine when you were not fine. You were simply managing because managing was what was required. The way grief had no proper season when you were too busy surviving to observe it. The way she had decided on this course, the agency, the arrangement, not from desperation but from a clear-eyed reading of her own situation, that she was 23 and alone and capable of a great deal and wanted a life that had room for all of it, and she had reasoned that the best chance of such a life was to find a man who valued the qualities others found difficult rather than tolerating them. "And did you find him?" Joel asked quietly. She looked at him steadily. "I am beginning to think so, yes," she said, which from Rose Doyle was the equivalent of a declaration written in the sky over the territory. He leaned forward and kissed her, which was not the first time he had kissed her, but was the first time the kiss had nothing cautious in it on either side. The Cobb situation resolved in October, in the way Rose had predicted. The final incident came on the 3rd of October, when 2 of Cobb's hired men were found on Joel's property attempting to divert a section of the creek bank with shovels. This was witnessed by both Joel and Tom Prout, who had ridden out together that morning, and by Francisco Garza, who happened to be checking his own southern boundary and arrived in time to see the full extent of what was being done. The 2 hired men rode off without making it a physical confrontation, which was to Cobb's credit in terms of the violence, but to his detriment in terms of the legal record. Rose compiled everything: 6 months of documentation, 3 witnessed incidents, the survey records showing continuous McCrae use of the creek boundary going back to the original land grant, Tom Prout's signed statement, Francisco Garza's signed statement, Joel's own detailed account of every conversation with Cobb since the first offer 2 years prior. They rode to the county seat to present it to Judge Harmon on a bright October morning, Joel and Rose together, Rose with the notebook in her bag and the calm expression of a person who has done their preparation and knows it. Judge Harmon was a compact man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a manner that did not waste time. He read Rose's compiled documentation with the thoroughness it deserved, and when he finished he looked up at her rather than at Joel and said, "You prepared this." "I did," Rose said. "You are not an attorney," he said. "No," she said. "I am a rancher's wife who has been watching a larger neighbor try to take our water rights through a manufactured legal claim for 6 months, and I have kept records." Harmon looked at her for a moment with an expression that was assessment rather than condescension. Then he looked at the documents again. "This is thorough," he said. "This is, in point of fact, more thorough than most of what attorneys bring me." He set the papers down. "I will issue a formal notice of trespass and a cessation order. If Cobb violates it, he faces a fine and the loss of any future claim to that creek boundary. Is that acceptable?" "That is entirely acceptable," Rose said. Joel said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because Rose had this fully in hand and he was content to let her have it. Cobb received the cessation order the following week. He did not come in person to the McCrae ranch again. The fence incident stopped. The cattle wandering stopped. The surveyor who had asked to cross the southern pasture sent a brief formal letter stating that the survey had been concluded and no further access would be required. By the end of October, the Cobb situation was, for all practical purposes, resolved. November arrived with the first cold edge of the high desert autumn, and the ranch work shifted to the preparations that winter required. There was wood to lay in and repairs to the barn against the weather, and the cattle to assess and certain decisions about the herd to be made. Joel and Rose worked through these things together now with an ease that had replaced the early careful negotiation of shared space and shared decision-making. They were, by November, genuinely in love. This was not something either of them announced. It was something that had happened in the accumulation of months, in the conversations on the porch and at the supper table and riding out to check the fence together, in the small adjustments they made to each other without discussion, in the way the house had become a house they both lived in rather than a house one of them had moved into. It was in the way Joel reached for her hand now without it being a decision, just a direction he moved in. It was in the way Rose looked at him across the yard when he was working, and something in her expression was not the measuring look, but a softer thing she had not entirely authorized. Alina Garza, who missed nothing, told Francisco in October that the McCraes had stopped being a practical arrangement and started being a marriage. Francisco said he had noticed in August. They argued about this mildly over supper, which was their preferred form of entertainment. Christmas came to Sagebrush Creek with particular warmth that year, or perhaps it was simply that Joel noticed warmth more than he had in 3 years of solitary observation. The Garzas hosted on Christmas Day, and the Pruitts came and Reverend Alcott and his wife, and the house was full of children and noise and Alina's remarkable cooking, and the kind of chaos that makes a person feel the world is generously populated. Rose sat at a long table crowded with the people who had become her community in 6 months, and talked and laughed and held Alina's newest baby, who had arrived in November and been named Louis. And Joel watched her from across the room and thought, with a clarity he had not expected, that he was the most fortunate man he knew. He told her this that night, riding home in the cold, clear dark, the horses moving steadily and their breath making small clouds in the cold air. He said, without preparation or particular arrangement, "I am very glad you wrote back." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "So am I more than glad," he said. "I want to be accurate about it. I am the kind of glad that changes how a person understands their whole situation." She looked at him, her face clear in the winter moonlight. "Joel McCrae," she said, and her voice had in it something he had only heard a few times, the softness she let through when she was not being careful about it. "Are you telling me you love me?" "I am trying to," he said. I'm less practiced at saying it than at feeling it." "Then feel it louder," she said and smiled, and it was the full smile, the one she did not perform. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand in the cold air above the frozen trail and held it, and she held his in return. "I love you," he said plainly, in the way he said the true things. "I love you too," she said. "I have been watching it happen to myself since about August and waiting to see what it would become. And this," she said, "which is better than I expected from an arrangement I agreed to for practical reasons." He laughed, and she laughed too, and the sound of it went out into the cold territory night, where the stars were numerous and close. The winter was not without its hardships, because the territory did not moderate its conditions for personal happiness. There was a storm in January that kept them housebound for 3 days, and during which 3 cattle were lost, and 2 sections of barn roof required emergency repair. There was the matter of the feed supply running shorter than anticipated and requiring a difficult cold ride to the Prute, spread to arrange a loan of hay, until the thaw made the roads to town passable again. There was the kind of ordinary friction that 2 people in close quarters in cold weather produce, small irritations that build when there is nowhere to go to discharge them. They argued twice in January. The first argument was about the cattle, specifically about a decision Joel made regarding the southern herd that Rose disagreed with and said so directly. The argument lasted 20 minutes and ended with Joel conceding she was right about one part of it and Rose conceding he was right about the other part. And then they made supper together in the resolution that followed, which had its own specific quality of warmth. The second argument was sharper, about a letter Rose had received from her Uncle Clement, who had heard about the Cobb situation in the second-hand way that news travels across the territory, and written to offer advice that was both unasked for and several months too late. Rose had written back a reply that Joel read over her shoulder, which she had not invited him to do, and he had offered an opinion on the tone of the reply, which she had not asked for either. She had told him in no uncertain terms that her correspondence with her uncle was her own affair, and she did not require editorial commentary on how she chose to express herself to family. He had told her that he understood that but was simply noting that the tone might create more difficulty than it resolved. She had told him that she appreciated his concern and was choosing not to act on it. He had pointed out that this was exactly what stubborn meant. She had told him that he had known that about her from the letter and had saddled his fastest horse anyway, so he could not claim surprise now. The silence after that particular exchange lasted 3 hours, during which Joel went out to work on fence repairs that did not urgently need making, and Rose wrote her letter exactly as she had intended to write it. When he came back in at dusk, she was making coffee and she handed him a cup without speaking, and after a moment he said, "You were right about the letter. It is your correspondence." "You were not wrong about the tone," she said, "but I considered it and decided I preferred honesty to strategy in this particular case." "Clement will likely write back more advice," Joel said. "Clement can write what he likes," Rose said. "I handle Clement." This made Joel smile, because it was so entirely accurate to everything he knew about her that it had the feeling of a portrait arriving at its final detail. "Yes," he said, "you do." She looked at him and smiled back, and the afternoon's difficulty dissolved in the specific manner that difficulties between 2 people who genuinely love each other dissolve when both parties are willing to finish the argument rather than preserve it. The spring of 1879 arrived with a generosity that the territory produced when it was inclined, the land greening up with the rains and the creek running well, and the cattle fat and multiplying. Joel expanded the herd that spring by 20 head, a decision he and Rose had made together over the winter based on the documentation of the previous year's yields and the current market prices for beef in the territorial markets. The addition of 20 cattle required additional fence and additional water management and additional labor, and they hired a young man named Carlos, who was 17 and the youngest son of a family in Sagebrush Creek who needed the income, and who turned out to be excellent with horses and willing to learn anything. Carlos was quiet and diligent and possessed of the excellent quality of working hard without requiring supervision, and his arrival changed the nature of the daily labor on the ranch in ways that gave both Joel and Rose more room to breathe. With Carlos handling a portion of the fence and cattle work, Joel had time to attend to the maintenance that had been deferred through the difficult winter, and Rose had time to expand the garden, which she did with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, consulting Alina about what grew well in the territory's particular soil, and designing the layout with an eye to both productivity and the long-term health of the ground. In April, Rose told Joel she was expecting. She told him in the morning, before the day's work began, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee. In the direct manner she told him everything important. She said she believed she was about 4 months along and that she had spoken with Doc Harding on the last trip to town, and he confirmed it. Joel sat with this information for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. He was looking at her and she was looking at him, and he could see in her face that she was reading him carefully, assessing his response with the attention she brought to things that mattered. He said, "Are you well? 4 months, you have been well the whole winter." "Mostly well," she said. "There were difficult mornings in February that I was careful not to advertise. I wanted to be certain before saying anything." "Of course," he said, understanding completely that she would have handled it exactly this way. "And now you are certain." "Doc Harding is certain," she said. "I was fairly certain in March." He set down his coffee and stood up and came around the table, which was not something he typically did in the morning, and she looked up at him with those steady brown eyes, and he took her face in his hands carefully, as though she was made of something precious and not at all fragile, and he kissed her forehead and then held her head against his chest for a long moment. "I am glad," he said, against her hair. He felt her exhale, a release of something she had perhaps been carrying more carefully than she let on. Her hands came up and rested at his sides. "Good," she said softly, "because I have opinions about several things relating to this situation, and I am going to need you to be glad." He laughed, which she likely felt rather than heard from where her head was against his chest, and it was the kind of laugh that comes from genuine joy rather than mere amusement. He told Alina first, because Rose asked him to, since Alina had a daughter born the previous summer and another child on the way, and was the most practically useful person in the territory for matters of this kind. Alina received the news with a sound that was partly a shout and partly a prayer of thanksgiving, and then immediately began discussing the practical matters, which was exactly what Rose needed and why she had asked Alina to be told first. The summer of 1879 was the best summer Joel could remember on the ranch. The land was productive, and the cattle were healthy, and Carlos proved himself worth twice his wages, and they gave him a small raise in July that made him look at them both with an expression of utter surprise, and then gratitude so genuine it was slightly uncomfortable. The relationship between Joel and Rose had settled into the deep ease of two people who have navigated enough difficulty together to trust the navigation, who know each other's rhythms and respect each other's territory, and have found that sharing space does not require the surrendering of self. Rose was, in her way, magnificent throughout the pregnancy. She was not a woman who performed fragility she did not feel, and she did not dramatically alter her daily life in ways that were not necessary, though she made sensible adjustments. She worked in the garden until late in the summer and maintained the household with the same competence she had always brought to it, accepting Alina's help when it was offered and when it was genuinely useful, and declining the more intrusive forms of well-meaning assistance from Delaprout, who had a tendency to arrive with an agenda. She also, during this summer, undertook a project she had been considering for months, which was a kind of practical education for the women of Sagebrush Creek who were managing homesteads and did not have access to the information that would make the management easier. It began informally, as a conversation with two women at the general store who had questions about a livestock ailment Joel recognized, and it grew from there into a regular Sunday gathering at the Garza Ranch, where 4 and then 6 and then 8 women met to share practical knowledge about crops and cattle and land management, and the various legal protections available to women under the territorial laws of the era, which were more limited than they should have been but which existed nonetheless. Rose had learned the relevant statutes from Francisco's legal references, and she shared them without drama, in the way she shared all information, as useful tools available to anyone who wanted to use them. Joel heard about these gatherings from Francisco, who had contributed his legal references with pleasure, and who remarked to Joel that his wife was quietly doing a thing that would matter to a lot of people for a long time. Joel already knew this. He had been watching Rose be Rose for over a year by this point, and he was no longer surprised by her capacity, though he was still regularly moved by it. The baby came in the middle of October, which Doc Harding had estimated and which turned out to be accurate. Elena was there, and Doc Harding, and Joel paced the porch in the prescribed manner of fathers throughout history until Elena opened the door and said, with the widest smile he had ever seen on a face that was accustomed to large expressions, that he had a son. A son. 8 pounds and vigorous, with a full head of dark hair and the immediately observable quality of extreme opinions about the world, which he expressed loudly from the first moment of his arrival in it. Joel went in and sat beside Rose, who was tired in the way a person is tired after doing something enormous, the productive exhaustion of completion rather than defeat, and he looked at the baby she was holding and then at her face. "He has my disposition," Rose said, in the dry tone she used when she was actually very moved. "He has your hair," Joel said. "He has your ears," she said. He took his son carefully when she passed him, this small, furious person who had just arrived in the world with such strong feelings about it, and he held him against his chest and looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Rose. "What shall we call him?" He had asked her this before, and they had discussed names but not settled. "Thomas," she said. "For my father," she paused. "If that is agreeable." "Thomas McCrae," Joel said, and the baby responded to the sound of his name with the expression of someone considering whether to approve it. "Thomas it is." Thomas was, from the first weeks of his life, a person of strong preferences and vigorous communication, which surprised no one who had met either of his parents. He slept in consolidated intervals that were not always at night, and he had opinions about being put down when he would prefer to be held, opinions he expressed without moderation. Rose managed these opinions with the same measured competence she brought to everything difficult, and Joel, who had not known how to hold an infant when Thomas arrived, and who learned by doing, managed them with a patience that slightly surprised him when he noticed it. They were, as a family of 3 in the long winter evenings of 1879 into 1880, very happy in the specific, earned way that people are happy when they have built something real together. The years moved in the way years do on land where the work is continuous and the investment is long. The ranch grew. Not dramatically, not beyond what they could manage well, but with the steady expansion of people who knew what they are doing and are thoughtful about it. By 1881, they had added another small herd and a second well, and Carlos had been with them 3 years and had the confidence of a man who knew his work and his place in the operation. He had also, in a development that charmed Rose considerably, begun courting the daughter of the family who ran the saddle shop in town, a young woman named Marisol who had her own opinions about everything, and who Rose declared immediately to be entirely appropriate for Carlos. Thomas walked at 11 months and talked early and had, by the age of 2, demonstrated the specific combination of curiosity, stubbornness, and analytical attention that was recognizable as a distillation of both his parents. He followed Joel around the ranch with the devoted intensity of a small person who has decided where the important things are happening and intends to be present for them. And he sat in Rose's lap during the Sunday gatherings at the Garza Ranch and listened to the women talking with the solemn interest of someone filing information away for future reference. In the spring of 1882, Rose told Joel she was expecting again. This announcement was less formally arranged than the first, delivered over supper on a Tuesday evening with the directness that characterized everything Rose did that mattered. Thomas was 2.5 and in the other room with Duke, who was getting old and slow but retained his position as Thomas's preferred companion. "A second," Joel said. "A second," Rose confirmed. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "Better than the first time in February." He reached across the table, the gesture that was entirely natural to him now, and took her hand. She turned it and held his. Thomas shouted something from the other room that was directed at Duke, who presumably did not respond. "2 children and the best cattle operation in this part of the territory," Joel said. "I am trying to identify the thing that is missing from this picture and I cannot find it." "There is nothing missing," Rose said. "No," he agreed. "There isn't." She looked at him across the supper table in the lamplight that was not different from the lamplight of 4 years ago when he had taken her hand for the first time and the air between them had changed. She looked at him and he looked at her, and what passed between them in that look was the accumulated weight of everything, the letters and the arrival and the Cobb situation, and the arguments in January and the Christmas at the Garzas and Thomas's birth, and the Sunday gatherings and every morning rising before the sun to work land that was theirs together. "I read the letter twice," he said, apropos of nothing and everything. She tilted her head slightly, not following. "Your uncle's letter," he said. "When he wrote that you were stubborn and difficult, I read that part twice." "I know," she said. "You told me. And then I saddled Calico," she smiled, "your fastest horse." "To think," he said, "because I needed to think about a letter that told me the most important thing I have ever learned about a person, which was that you would rather be known accurately than liked easily." He paused. "I thought about that for 11 miles and I wrote back that afternoon." Rose was quiet for a moment, and her eyes had the brightness that she did not always allow but which appeared now. "Uncle Clement thought those 2 sentences would discourage you," she said. "I made him include them because I could not endure the idea of arriving somewhere and finding that I had been misrepresented. I would rather not go than go under false pretenses. And if they had discouraged me—" He said, "Then you would not have been worth going to," she said simply. He stood up and came around the table, which he did sometimes when the distance between them was suddenly more than he could let remain, and she stood to meet him, and he held her in the lamplight of their kitchen on the ranch his father had built on the land they had defended together. And Thomas made another noise from the other room, and Duke presumably responded with whatever response a very old border collie makes to a 2-year-old. And outside the territory was wide and dark, and going on in all directions, and everything that mattered was in this room. Their daughter arrived in November of 1882, round and alert and possessed of eyes that were the same steady brown as her mother's from the first day, eyes that looked at the world with an attention that her parents recognized completely. They named her Clara, which had been Joel's mother's name, and Rose had suggested it without knowing the history, and Joel had told her the history, and she had said that seemed like all the reason needed. Thomas received Clara with the suspicious interest of a 3-year-old encountering competition, and then, within 2 weeks, with the protective devotion of a person who has decided something belongs to him in the best possible way. He was, by the time Clara could sit up and look at him with her considering eyes, her most dedicated audience, showing her things and explaining them with the detailed thoroughness of someone who had recently learned everything and wanted to share the full curriculum. Carlos and Marisol married in the spring of 1883 in a ceremony at the church in Sagebrush Creek that the whole community attended, and Joel stood up for Carlos as a witness, and Rose sat in the front with Alina Garza, who cried freely because Alina always cried at weddings, and considered it a proper tribute to the institution. Carlos continued at the ranch and Marisol continued at her family's saddle shop, and they built a small house on the eastern edge of the McCrae property that Joel had offered them free of charge in exchange for Carlos's continued work, a transaction that was far more weighted in Carlos's favor than Joel presented it, because Carlos had been doing the work of 2 men for 3 years, and the house was a fraction of what he was owed. Francisco Garza told Joel after the wedding that he had done a good thing. Joel said that Rose had been the one who suggested the house arrangement. Francisco said that this was not surprising, and Joel said no, it was not. The Sunday gatherings at the Garza Ranch had grown by 1883 into something that even Rose described with a degree of satisfaction that she usually reserved for the resolution of practical difficulties. 12 women came regularly from Sagebrush Creek and the surrounding properties, and the subjects discussed had expanded beyond the practical agricultural and legal matters to include a conversation about the education available to the children of the territory, which was insufficient and unevenly distributed in the ways that such things were throughout the West in this era. The children of Mexican families and the poorer settler families often having less access than others. Rose had thoughts about this. Elena had thoughts about this. Between them, and with Francisco's assistance on the legal and political side, they had petitioned the territorial government for a second school and been told it was not currently funded. They were not finished with the petition. Rose had simply added it to the notebook. By the time Thomas was 4 and Clara was 1, and the territory was edging toward the mid-1880s, the McCrae Ranch was established in the way that things become established when they are properly built and consistently maintained. Not famous, not dramatic, but solid. Known. The property that Harlan Cobb had tried to diminish was instead quietly flourishing, and Cobb himself had sold his own Western spread the previous year to a livestock company from Colorado and moved on, which everyone in the valley found comprehensively satisfying. Joel turned 34 in the spring of 1883, and Rose turned 28 that same season, and they marked both occasions in the small way they marked most things that mattered, which was to say privately, and with meaning rather than publicly and with performance. On Joel's birthday, she gave him a leather-bound journal she had spent 2 months arranging through a bookbinder in Santa Fe, his initials stamped on the cover in the same way the ranch brand was registered. On Rose's birthday, he took a full day from the ranch work, left Carlos and Tom Pruitt in charge, and rode with her out to the far southern boundary where the creek bent and the cottonwoods grew thick, and the land was at its most beautiful. And they sat by the water with a packed lunch and no particular agenda and talked and were quiet in turns and watched the water. Rose said, sitting with her back against a cottonwood and her boots off and her feet in the edge of the creek, "I think about the letter sometimes." "My letter," he said, "the one Clement wrote, the one that described me." She was looking at the water at the light on it. "I think about the fact that I made him include those 2 sentences because I wanted to be seen accurately, and that the person who read them most carefully turned out to be you. It told me everything important," he said. He was sitting beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Thomas was with Elena today and Clara was with Della Pruitt, and they had this particular afternoon in the spring of the territory, entirely to themselves. "What did it tell you?" she asked, genuinely curious in the way she was curious about things, as though she wanted the full answer. "It told me you had the kind of self-knowledge that most people spend their whole lives avoiding," he said. "It told me you insisted on being honest even when the honest version of yourself might cost you something. It told me you had an uncle who loved you enough to honor an uncomfortable request." He paused. "And it told me that the person who arranged for those words to be in that letter was someone worth riding a long distance to find." She turned and looked at him, and the afternoon light was on her face, and the creek sound was behind them, and she looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him when she thought he could not see her clearly, which was the way she looked at him when she was allowing herself to feel the full extent of something without managing it back to a manageable size. "Joel McCrae," she said. "Rose Doyle," he said, the way he had said it the day she arrived, all those years ago at the stage stop, and she remembered that he had done this and the corners of her eyes came up. "McCrae now," she said. "Rose McCrae," he agreed. "Though you have always been Doyle to me in the sense that matters. The person in the letter, the person who made her uncle tell the truth." She leaned and put her head on his shoulder, and they sat by the creek in the cottonwood shade, and the afternoon was long and slow and entirely theirs. By the time Thomas started school at the schoolhouse in Sagebrush Creek in 1884, the world he walked into was one that his parents had had a hand in shaping. The second school that Rose and Alina had petitioned for had been approved by the territorial government the previous fall, funded in part by a contribution from a land grant that Francisco Garza had maneuvered through the local council with the patient diplomatic skill that characterized everything Francisco did. It was not the full reform that was needed, and Rose acknowledged this plainly in the Sunday gathering when the news came through, noting that the injustices in how education was distributed along lines of money and ethnicity remained real and required continued attention. But it was a step, and it was a step that would not have happened without the women in that room. Thomas began school with the confident sociability of a child who has been the center of two attentive adults' world for 5 years and is now discovering the larger world of peers, which is a significant adjustment that he managed with the McCrae stubbornness and the Doyle directness that his teacher, a young woman named Miss Abernathy, reported in a diplomatically phrased note to his parents as strong character and considerable initiative. Rose read this note at the supper table and then looked at Joel. "Strong character and considerable initiative," she said. "Accurate," Joel said. "Exactly," she said, and her smile was the full one, the one she reserved for things that were genuinely and unambiguously good. Clara, at 2, showed every indication of inheriting the same combination of qualities, with the additional element of her father's patience, which Rose privately considered the most useful possible genetic contribution. Clara was a child who watched things carefully before acting, who sat through the Sunday gatherings with the absorbing attention that Thomas had displayed before her, and who, at 18 months, had already demonstrated that she understood far more of what was said around her than the adults who said it always realized. In the long evenings of 1884 and 1885, when the children were in bed and the ranch was settled for the night, and the territory outside was dark and vast and full of its own deep existence, Joel and Rose sat on the porch that faced south toward the creek and talked, or were quiet according to what the evening required. These evenings were the texture of their life together in its most essential form, the place where everything that needed saying eventually got said, and everything that needed to be quiet was allowed to be so. He told her one such evening that he thought about the moment she had stepped off the stage sometimes, the way she had looked at Sagebrush Creek with that measuring look, taking its full measure before deciding what she thought about it. "What do you think about it now?" he asked. "All these years in." She considered, which she always did when a question deserved consideration. The evening was warm in the early summer of 1885, and the creek sound carried on the light wind, and the stars were the enormous territory stars that never lost their effect. "I think it is mine," she said, "not in the sense of ownership. In the sense that belongs to a person means it is the place where they are fully themselves." She paused. "I did not have that before. After my parents I was managing, I was capable, but I was not at home anywhere. I think I had given up on the idea that home was something I could have and had replaced it with competence, which is useful but is not the same thing." He was quiet, listening. "And now," he said. "Now I am home," she said. "This ranch, this land, you." She glanced at him. Thomas and Clara, Alina and Francisco, the women on Sunday afternoons, the creek. She paused. It is a great deal more than I thought I was going to get when I wrote back to that agency." He put his arm around her on the porch bench, and she leaned into him, and they watched the darkness over the southern pasture where the creek ran and the cottonwoods were silent shapes against the stars. And the night was warm and long and full of all the things they had built. In 1886, the year Thomas turned 7 and Clara turned 4, Rose found out she was expecting for the third time. She told Joel in the morning again, at the kitchen table, with the same directness she had always used. He looked at her, and the feeling that moved through him was the same feeling as the first time, the particular quality of gratitude that has nothing performative in it. "3," he said. "3," she confirmed. "Thomas will be pleased," he said. "Clara will have thoughts." Rose laughed, which she did more easily now than she had in the early years, the laugh coming out without the infrequency of before, because she was a person who had fully arrived in her life and whose laugh therefore had more occasions to be needed. "Clara will definitely have thoughts," she said. The third child arrived in November of 1886, a second son, healthy and loud, and they named him William for Rose's father, whose full name had been William Thomas Doyle. So in the names of their children they had honored both lines completely. Thomas received William with the elder sibling authority of someone who has 7 years of experience and intends to use it. Clara received William with the expression of a 4-year-old who is performing magnanimity while privately reserving judgment. William turned out to have his grandfather Doyle's temperament, easy and sociable and possessed of a warmth that filled rooms, a quality neither of his parents exactly had but which they recognized with the pleasure of seeing something new arrive in the world. He was the child who came to people rather than waiting for people to come to him, who distributed his affection broadly and without economy, who by the age of 3 was the particular favorite of Alina Garza's children and of old Duke, who in his final year of life found in William the devoted and gentle companion he needed. Duke died in the spring of 1888, in the way old dogs die when they have been well cared for and have had a full life, lying in the sun on the porch of the house he had known, since it was a quiet place with one man living in it. Thomas cried in the honest way of a 9-year-old who understands loss but has not yet learned to manage it into a presentable form, and Joel sat with him on the porch steps and let him cry, and said that Duke had been a good dog, and that missing him was the right response to that. Clara did not cry at the time, but was found 2 days later sitting on the porch in the exact spot where Duke had always sat, not doing anything, just sitting there. Rose found her and sat down beside her, and did not say anything either, and they sat together in the dog's spot in the afternoon sun until Clara was ready to go back inside. William, who was too young to fully understand, placed a small rock on the spot where Duke was buried under the cottonwood by the barn, because he had seen Thomas do this for a calf that died the previous winter, and had understood it as the appropriate response to loss. These were the children of Joel McCrae and Rose Doyle, who had come to each other through a letter that described her as stubborn and difficult, and who had built something true and lasting from the arrangement that both of them had entered with clear eyes and honest intentions. The ranch in 1889 was a going concern of real substance, with a herd of healthy size and a reputation in the territorial markets for quality that meant their beef commanded a fair price, and their name was known by the buyers who came through each fall. Carlos and Marisol had 2 children of their own by now, and the small house on the eastern edge was a proper home with a garden and chickens and the sounds of a family in it. The Sunday gatherings continued, led now as much by Alina and by 2 other women who had grown into leadership over the years as by Rose, who encouraged this distribution of ownership deliberately, understanding that a thing which belongs to one person is fragile in ways that a thing held by many is not. Joel was 40 years old in the spring of 1889, and he rode Calico's daughter, a mare called Copper, because Calico had gone to a dignified retirement in the far pasture 3 years prior and was visited regularly by Thomas, who had learned to ride on her. He was, at 40, a man who had the deep settledness of someone who knows exactly who he is and where he belongs, and whose face showed not the weight of years, but the particular quality of a person who has been weathered by a life he chose and would choose again. Rose was 34, and in her full power, which was something Joel thought about sometimes with a quality of wonder that had never diminished. She had taken the stubborn and difficult description that her uncle had written, and she had built a life around those qualities that made them what they actually were, which was integrity and rigor, and the refusal to be less than herself in any situation that mattered. She had built friendships and community and legal protection for people who needed it, and a family that was thriving, and she had done all of this while loving him in the direct, unperforming way she loved everything, without excess and without reservation. On the evening of their 11th anniversary, which they marked in June, Joel took down the original letter from the box where he kept important papers. The letter from Clement Doyle, dated the spring of 1878. He took it to the kitchen table where Rose was reading and set it in front of her. She looked at it and then at him. "I found it in the papers," he said, "looking for the fence survey." She picked it up and read it. After a moment she said, "Clement's handwriting has always been atrocious." "True," he said, "but he wrote the right things." She read the part about stubborn and difficult, which he had read twice 11 years ago, and which had sent him out to saddle Calico and ride 11 miles in the spring light thinking about what it meant that a person had insisted on being known accurately. She set the letter down and looked at it for a moment. "I was so angry with him for years," she said, "for not managing things better after my parents, for moving to the boarding house and leaving me managing his affairs, and then the agency when I needed independence more than obligation." She paused. "And then he wrote those 2 sentences in that letter because I asked him to, and he honored the request, and a man 11 miles away read them twice and saddled his fastest horse and wrote me back the same afternoon." "You know about the same afternoon. You told me years ago," she said. "You wrote back the same afternoon. I have always found that to be the most accurate thing about you. When you know something, you act on it. You make good decisions easier," he said. "You are a very easy person to act toward." She looked at him with the full look, the one she reserved for the real things. "Clement did a good thing with those 2 sentences," she said. "I should tell him so." "His last letter suggested his health is improving," Joel said. "Clement was in his 60s now and had been unwell the previous winter." "I should invite him here," Rose said. "He has never come. He sent his niece into the territory and married her off to a stranger and has never come to see what she made of it." "Write the letter," Joel said. "Invite him, we have room." She nodded. "Thomas will like him," she said. "They have the same way of talking about things." "And Clara will be politely skeptical of him until he earns it," Joel said. "And William will immediately love him," Rose said. "Which will help," he smiled. "Our children are thoroughly themselves." "Yes," she said, with the satisfaction of a person looking at a thing that has turned out exactly right. "They are." Clement Doyle came in the autumn of 1889, on the same stage line that had brought Rose 11 years before, and he was smaller than Joel had imagined from the letters, a compact man in his mid-60s with the eyes that Rose had inherited, and a manner that was reserved until he understood the situation, at which point it opened completely. He arrived and stood in the yard of the McCrae ranch, and looked at the property with the expression of a man seeing something he had sent into the world return to him whole and thriving. And when Rose embraced him, it was with the full warmth of someone who has forgiven the past completely, without requiring the past to have been different. Thomas, who was 10, assessed Clement Doyle with the measuring intelligence that was entirely his mother's, and then asked him 6 questions in rapid succession about his life in Abilene that had Clement blinking with surprise, and then laughing with genuine pleasure. Clara, who was 7, was politely skeptical exactly as predicted and asked Clement a single pointed question about why he had never visited before, which Rose fielded with the diplomacy that Clara's directness sometimes required. William, who was 2, climbed directly into Clement's lap within 40 minutes of arrival and went asleep there, which made Clement sit very still for the better part of an hour so as not to disturb him. In the evenings that Clement was with them, he and Joel sat on the porch after the children were in bed, and Clement told him things about Rose's parents, about her childhood, about the person she had been before the fever took them. Joel listened with the hunger of a man who loves someone's history as much as he loves the person, and he understood things about Rose that illuminated things he had already known. On Clement's last evening, when the children were in bed and Rose was in the house, and the autumn dark was around them, Clement said to Joel, "When I wrote that letter, I thought those 2 sentences would end the correspondence. I thought any man who was looking for a wife through an agency was looking for someone agreeable and quiet. I wrote them because she made me, and I expected them to do the damage she was willing to risk." And when I wrote back, Joel asked, "She brought me the letter," Clement said. "She read me the part where you said it had not discouraged you, and she did not say anything. She just held the letter and looked out the window for a while, and I thought, well, this might be the thing." "It was the thing," Joel said. "Yes," Clement said, "it was the thing." Clement went back to Abilene in the cool October, carrying a jar of Rose's preserves and a drawing Thomas had made him of the ranch, and a small woven bracelet that Clara had produced, in the days after her initial skepticism had resolved into measured approval, as a going-away gift. He wrote when he arrived home, the first letter of what became a regular correspondence that lasted the remainder of his life. Rose put the letter from 1878 back in the box with the other important papers, but sometimes, on the long winter evenings when the fire was going, and the children were doing the various things children do in a warm house, she took it out and read Clement's 2 sentences and thought about the chain of things they had set in motion, the reading and the rereading, the fastest horse, the letter written the same afternoon, the 11 miles, the arrangement that became a marriage that became a life. The territory was changing in these years, as territories do, pressing toward statehood, filling with people and with the complications that people bring, the ongoing and often unjust pressures on the land and on the people who had been there longest, the politics that Rose followed in the territorial papers and discussed in the Sunday gatherings with the same careful attention she had always brought to things that mattered. She wrote letters to the territorial representative on 3 separate occasions in 1889 and 1890 on the subject of land rights and the treatment of the Hispanic families who had been ranching the territory since before it was a territory. Francisco Garza told Joel that his wife was going to be a significant trouble to comfortable men for the foreseeable future, and Joel said that he was aware of this and considered it one of her most important qualities. Thomas grew into a young man of serious intelligence and the kind of practical competence that his father had, with his mother's capacity for systematic thought, and by the time he was 12, he was riding range with Joel and Carlos, and asking questions about the operation that indicated he was already thinking about it as something that would eventually be his responsibility. Rose watched this with a satisfaction that was layered, the satisfaction of good parenting, and the satisfaction of seeing a child become fully themselves, and the satisfaction of knowing that what had been built on this land was going to be cared for by someone who understood its value. Clara was at 11 a reader of everything she could find, with the focus and analytical quality of someone who would eventually do something with the serious mind she had been given, and Rose made it her particular project to ensure that Clara had access to books and to the full education that the territory's improving school system could provide, and where the system came up short, Rose filled the gaps herself. Sitting with Clara in the evenings with history books and figures, and the maps that she had loved herself from childhood. William grew into the sunshine disposition that had been his since birth, the child who made friends effortlessly and smoothed difficulties with his natural warmth, who would grow up to be the kind of man that other men trusted instinctively, which was a quality the world always needed and never quite had enough of. On the night of 1891, when Thomas was 12 and Clara was 9, and William was 4, Joel and Rose sat on the porch of the house his father had built in 1863, on the land they had defended together and worked together and raised children on and built a life from. And the night was the full territory night with its generous stars and its wide dark distances. And the sound of the creek carried up from the south with the constancy that had never changed in all the years Joel had been listening to it. Rose had her feet tucked under her on the porch bench, and her coffee going cold beside her, and a book closed on her knee, done with reading for the evening but not yet ready to go inside. Joel had his arm around her in the way it had been since September of 1878, which was as natural as breathing now, and she leaned against him in the way she leaned only when she was entirely without guard, which was only here, only in these evenings on their porch. "Thomas asked me today if the ranch would be his someday," she said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it would be his and Clara's and William's, that it was not a thing that passed to one person but a thing that was built by the family and belonged to the family." She paused. "He thought about that and then said it made sense." "He gets that from you," Joel said. "The capacity to accept the correct answer even when it was not what you expected." She smiled against his shoulder. "He gets more from you than you think. The patience, the way he looks at the cattle, the way he fixed that fence section last week, exactly the way you would have done it." "The stubbornness is yours," Joel said. "Both our contributions, then," she said. He held her on the porch in the dark, and the creek ran and the territory went on in all directions, and the house behind them held 3 sleeping children, and everything they had made together in 13 years of a life that had started with 2 sentences in a letter that were meant as a warning, and turned out to be the most accurate introduction one person has ever given another. He kissed the top of her head, in the lamplight from the window that fell across the porch boards between them, and she made the small sound she made when she was entirely content, the sound she had never made in the early months but which had appeared at some point in the middle years, and which Joel considered the most valuable sound he had ever heard. "Stubborn and difficult," he said softly, into her hair. "Every day," she said, without moving. "Every day," he agreed, and held her, and the night was long and warm and full of all the things they were to each other, and the life they had built from a letter read twice and a fast horse saddled, and a woman who had insisted on being known as she actually was, and had found at the end of 11 miles the man who had read that description, and found it not a warning but a promise.